Hello there, welcome back. I hope that was quick enough to come back. And we thank and welcome Mr. Vijay Kumar out here, who's going to be talking about rethinking customer voice in digital world. Amazing. Over to you, Mr. Vijay. I'm not going to take much time. Please start.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. This is Vijay Kumar Ivaturi. My short name is IVK. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Crayon Data. I have spent more than 30 years in tech industry, more than 20 years in corporate, and almost a decade as an entrepreneur. So I'm going to give an outline of how I look at rethinking customer voice in digital era in a short presentation. So I will speak for about 12 to 15 minutes, and then we can have a Q&A. So I have looked at this topic in two ways. I call it two shifts and two periods. So the two shifts I kept in mind in analyzing customer voice in the current era is the shift from the product-centric to customer-centric systems. I think that's an important factor which changed the way we look at customer voice in a digital world. The second one is obvious, and that is a technology and a behavioral shift which is happening today. So I would say these are the two shifts I have seen in my career, and I will talk about my experience through these periods, both as a corporate leader and as well as an entrepreneur with a focus on both computer communication tech and behavioral science. As it is a short talk, I have looked at the whole time period into two eras. For the sake of simplicity, I divided the landscape in into two periods. One, what I would call as a pre-digital era, which I would club the analog era, which is the paper system or the physical meeting system, as well as the electronics era with not much of digital channels. And the current era, again, I clubbed into one large one, which is the web first and mobile first models. There are some digital analysis systems where we differentiate between web and mobile first, but for the simplicity, I have put them into one era. So with this, I would discuss the major changes which took place across these periods. And as it is more relevant today, what is the current crisis impact I see in these systems as on today, and perhaps the way I see the future unfolding in this. I know this is a tech event and focused on technology. So instead of taking a pure marketing view or a business view, I would like to cover a bit of technology underpinnings in this to understand the way the customer voice or the customer journey changed for both B2B and B2C contexts. To give a conceptual anchoring or mooring, I would quote Philip Kotler, the marketing guru, who has recently redefined his famous model of marketing and said there are three major shifts for customers in the connected world, which is essentially digital. One is exclusive to inclusive. Second is vertical to horizontal. And third, individual to social. Perhaps it sums up what has changed. But let's go back where it all started, into the pre-digital era, and just see how things were when it came to customer interaction. The customer context in the pre-digital era for both B2B and B2C was essentially voice. Either it is a physical meeting or a voice of customer in a face-to-face meeting or a survey, or perhaps a voice call on your telephone. I would also say this was a time where the product-centric models were there. In other words, everything is designed around a product. The customer was not at the center. It was just beginning to shift. from product to customer centric. We should also note that the fixed line communication, the age-old telephone system, was the dominant factor. And in fact, if I have to look at the technology challenge at the time, is to bridge the data systems of voice, data systems of the enterprise, and the voice systems of the communication to make sense of it. If you look at those solutions, we all worked on those systems, where the biggest challenge was to look at how to connect a customer's voice to an ACD system, a automatic call distribution, but bring up the context of customer data in front of the agent screen. It used to be a marvel to do such systems. And I think this is, I would say, one of the first integrations of a customer context and a communication context. We should also remember that voice was either digitally switched, but it was still an analog carrier. It's a TDM voice, for those people who understand communication. And the networks on the other side were the IP networks, but not so much interconnection between them. Therefore, the emphasis of customer handling or customer journey was more about how you handle the call rather than any analytics on the data. There used to be a voice analytics of such calls to see what the customer said, what he or she meant, or what he complained, or what she sought. But it is using a human agent to join the call to monitor the customer experience. This is, I would say, maybe in the middle of mid-90s or late 90s. I used to write such systems myself. And the solutions were either inbound or outbound, essentially somebody calling in or somebody calling out. And it is very closely integrated with the sector you are associated with. Is it FMCG, consumer goods? Is it white goods? Is it other kind of products of industry? So I think it was very tightly integrated to a certain sector or industry. To use a database view, I would say it was a segmentation based on rules or supervised in today's ML world. And call level severities of complaints were also hard-coded, I would say. Coming to the digital era, I think the first shift is that the customer became the center, and hence all systems were designed around it. I would also say that this is the first time we also defined customer voice to include things which are beyond voice. So it's not just the physical voice of the customer. What we meant is a customer journey or customer experience across many digital platforms. So it is quite typical today that the path traversal by the customer on the web, on the call, and mobile is tracked, and you define the points of engagement and therefore the experience. When we shifted this to mobile first, we added more personalization because now we can identify the unique user to some extent. To a great extent by mobile ID, but it can be mapped to a user if you know how to deduplicate it. But the shift which became more interesting on mobile is the context of social. So the social context integration kicked in when the social media influence became a key factor. In other words, it became a horizontal view and not a vertical view of a sector. Coming to a little more detail, many of the standard workflows of an enterprise, whether it is B2B or B2C, started doing what we call experience wheel. Look at the points of touch or points of contact and define what kind of experience you deliver, positive, negative, neutral, and try to take a feedback. So the managing the journey within the business context and within the social context, that became the primary purpose of looking at customers' voice in a very broad sense in today's world. To put it more succinctly, it's a blend of joy of discovery with purchase digitally. Because how to make it a physical experience of discovery, but still you do a transaction digitally, and how to integrate those two. The, the advantage of physical space discovery versus a digital discovery as well as transacting online. So it became a little more complex, I would say. There are many enterprises today which actually do B2B2C. So here we come with a kind of a question. Whose journey are we talking about? Customer or consumer? Now, the classical definition is customer is the person who pays. But if you are in a B2B2C, it is the consumer who uses it. So sometimes the experience of both are important. Generally, it is driven from the user experience backwards, but there is a point to be noted. As these systems evolved, there are two traits which are key differentiators for this era. In fact, I would say this is my main point of the talk, that there are two things which changed everything in this era, including the use of technology. One is a user consulting socially for information and advice, which didn't exist before. It existed maybe informally and physically, but not like today. The second one is advocating it once they are upset or impressed. In other words, you actually use the customer as an advocate or advocacy. These two are the underpinnings for many of the solutions we build for defining a customer journey. In fact, this is where AI and ML are applied for both engagement and conversations, and to see how to drive it for a better experience and hence a better experience in commercial gain. Now, coming back to the platform side, if I look back and look at the areas, the first and the foremost which changed many of these things, and for those of us who worked in those areas, it is the digitization of voice. We today carry voice as a payload on an IP network. It was not the case before, which changed many things for analysis, including voice analytics. The second one is most of the channels of engagement are digitized. In other words, they can be scaled as well as they can be mined for insights. The third one is the social side, which is also digital, which gives us an interesting view into things which are outside the enterprise context. The data sets which we normally do not see in an enterprise, but nevertheless influence the purchase or the journey. It is about the interests of the consumers, the intent of the consumer, the insights they share outside, which can be leveraged for an enterprise business context. The mobile device one is an easier one. You have a unique identifier, and for most people, it is always present and it is always on. So you're always available in that sense. From a compute perspective, I think we solved the problem of scaling, at least the horizontal scaling, for both multimodal and near real time for most cases. I would say most, because there are some exceptions. But at the end of the day, the biggest challenge of any such system is to improve the context value of the user. If I know the context in which a consumer or a customer is in, I can add more value. Most of these solutions of technology are essentially to figure out what the context is. Now, it's also on the same property, which is for data sets. We also look at the behavioral and emotive states of understanding, including in India context, understanding mixed language. So it gave you what you call an enriched experience for a customer, but all of it without he or she ever asking for it. It is kind of a push model, I would say. A few examples. So due to the paucity of time, I'll be quick. Let's take digital banking, a classical example where a typical banking application, take for example how your remittances flow in a region. that gives you how your money moves or how your cash moves. But then you can blend it with your social and other dimensions and get a better understanding of the consumer or the user, and maybe define a lending pattern or a lending product, or analyze their risk. Now, this was not possible before because you are overlaying a remittance, which is a transaction on a geospatial plane, but you blend it with a social data set. A similar example in travel agency. Many people call up an agency saying that I would like to uh, get some help on, say, planning a vacation. And they will have typically one or two destinations in mind. But then if that is not available, what next to offer? So figuring out the next best action based on the customer's interest, which you can perhaps mine both from the social side and from the transaction side, is another application of managing a customer's journey. In other words, as in travel industry, it is known that you involve yourself in the dream phase and not in the just the plan and booking phase. It's a typical example even for an airline, which I mentioned on the slide. When it comes to banks, it's the same argument for, say, campaigns. How to improve relevance, at the same time keep the novelty factor up, which keeps them interested. Again, this is derived from external data sets, which will enrich what is there in the enterprise. The same logic applies to credit card companies. Do you match offers to the merchants you have, or the users you have, or do you do the other way? You know the user and then try to match the offer or get the offer or find the merchant. So this both way discovery has become possible in the real world in the digital era. I will touch upon briefly on the way I see in the current model, in the current crisis.
Sorry to interrupt. 5 minutes, Vijay.
Yeah, thank you. Now, while we say we are in digital era, we are not exactly 100% digital. There is still a physical meeting required. There is an element of persuasion and a vocal interaction, etc. So it is not completely digital in that sense. It's a hybrid world. As we often say, it is the channel which is digitized. The experience is still analog. We are humans at the end of the day. But it is digital first model. One thing I would say is the current period is that the fluidity in scope. I think we are looking at how to manage a customer journey or how to make things work for them without worrying too much about the scope and contract and commercial dimensions. I think that shows customer empathy. What do I see going forward? Aftermath. I would say that digital and remote working will be the standard work practices, but we still need to keep an emotive connect. I think that will be a challenge and maybe something we have to solve. We also believe that the efficiency side of the organization is quite optimized as on today, or will be optimized with the tools. But how to keep an experience beyond the transaction convenience? I think that is something which we should keep in mind. I do have a few questions which are open. One is intrusion versus personalization. You can personalize for enhancing experience, but we should remember that limitation of scope and proportionality of the usage of data is something to be kept in mind. We also need to understand that when we mine for context, there are subcultural differences in interpretation. It is the same thing for advocacy. When you incentivize for somebody to advocate your product or service, one has to look at authenticity in the claim and the trust factor. It's the same argument when it comes to convenience versus loyalty. Advocacy doesn't mean you have loyalty. Luxury market is a good example. I may recommend a BMW, I may not buy it. It's the last one is about bot versus human agent. At the end of the day, one has to remember there is an agency and identity in a transaction. It is generally considered human. I think there's something we should keep in mind when we look it forward. My closing remarks: a guided journey by context, but not a scripted journey by segmentation. So we should not be completely supervised in that sense. In my view, customer is the end note in any of the current octaves, and they become the basis for the next rhythm in the business. At the end of the day, the firm which owns the experience owns the customer, not just the billing relationship. I think that's my last slide, and thank you.
Sure then. Thank you so much,
How do I
Vijay.
get back?
You can go back to AirMeet, and then
Yeah.
you can unshare the screen. You can
Yeah,
click
I
on
have come to AirMeet.
Yeah, you can click on unshare your screen at the bottom. You can see that red color icon right next to that. Right next to that. Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much. Sure then. So I think we can quickly grab a question if it is there. I don't see anyone wants to come on stage and ask a question. You can click on raise hand icon on your right hand side. You can come on stage, talk to Mr. Vijaya, and then ask a question. Anyone wants to do that one right away? Or if you don't want to do that one, show yourself on stage. You can actually key in the questions at question section. Okay, okay. Sonia is saying that it was a super succinct presentation. Okay. Okay, fine.
Thank you.
So I think there might be a few more questions which might pop up. Okay, there is one question from Upendra on the right hand side.
There is one question, I think.
Yes, there is one.
Yes.
So it says, how is customer data privacy going to evolve in the coming year? Yes.
It's actually a good question, and I would assume you are asking in the context of India. And I think the data privacy in India, we don't have full clarity on what exactly is the operative clauses of the privacy while the draft is there. So I cannot really comment on that. But I think one thing we should keep in mind is that one is limitation of scope for which the data is collected, and proportionality of the usage of data in applications we should keep in mind. So you would say being fair to the data we got, right? So I think it is still evolving. There are many people asking for compliance, but in India we don't have yet a definitive operative clause to say we comply. We all look at GDPR and then try to meet some of the requirements, both as a data controller and as a data processor.
Thank you so much, Vijaya. So with this, we're going to end this session. Very informative one, and I hope you've been. And there's a lot of members actually waiting to, reach you as well, which we are going to help you as well after the event. And then there's one more question, but Deepak, we have to ramp it up. We have to go to the next session. But your questions will be answered by Mr. Vijaya itself. So thank you so much, Deepak, as well, and thank you, Vijaya. And then let's go. Thank you so much again. Oh, and then I think I have to give you a big round of applause. I think you know how to do it. At the bottom of the screen, there's emojis. You can do that one. So we're still, trying to replicate the real life events, even though we are locked down. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, Vaj. Thank you. Bye.